As the invasion began at midnight with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, including also the booting on of various electronic warfare assets throughout the entire country by the Trojan shock forces, as also aviation-based from the Air Force's fixed-wing aircraft of both the Russian and Chinese Air Forces, the Russian VVS and Chinese PLAAF, were jamming American redundant radio communications as well as radar systems and additional systems that were not directly connected to the internet and thus couldn't be hacked or connected or dependent upon satellite and thus weren't affected by the anti-sat strikes. And now, with the electronic warfare assets effectively taking away the remaining capabilities, America was effectively thrust back into the Stone Age. It was now, in fact, in a worse position than the Iraqis were in the first Gulf War, as they now could effectively see nothing except for what was in front of them, and would be surprised with nasty surprises at each and every turn upon the modern fluid battlefield. By contrast, the coalition forces had total ISR dominance. They also had complete IT and communications dominance, and of course they had the best AI, real-time AI battlefield data processing systems on Earth. These contributed enormously to the capabilities of these invading forces. As it pertained to the fighting going on in the DFW Metroplex, this was the largest metropolitan area within the entire South Central invasion sector, and although Houston was the biggest city as a standalone city, as was the nation's fourth biggest city, its metro area, as a combined metro area, was actually a little smaller than the DFW Metroplex, as there were just over 7 million in the Houston area, whereas the DFW Metroplex had 8 million inhabitants. It was an enormous urban area as a combined urban area, and not only was the relatively large 59th PLA Group Army, a PLA Reserve Group Army, but heavily armed and up for the task, involved in this battle space, but they also had assistance from the active duty 77th PLA Group Army as their A300 battalion, which was the A300 system, being the longest range artillery system in the world, and it was also capable of firing several different munition types, as it had its standard 300mm pods, which could fire the longest range 300mm rockets that in existence, which had a 187-mile range, or they could fire the 370mm rockets, which were even more destructive than the already enormously devastating 300mm rockets, but they had a slightly shorter range than these 300mm rockets, or they could fire the Fire Dragon miniature short-range tactical ballistic missiles, which one of the several firing batteries within the 77th Group Army's A300 Battalion would be firing in support of the PLA 59th Group Army. Although the PLA 59th Group Army, within their 19th Artillery Brigade, had 300mm artillery systems, these were the PHL-03 systems that equipped most of the reserve forces artillery battalions of their 300mm artillery, and they had an 80-mile range, which was a very long range, but the A300 was simply far more advanced and far more destructive, and it outranged anything on the modern battlefield and equipped all of the PLA's active duty artillery forces within their heaviest hitting systems, being the 300mm battalions, as well as also some of the PLA reserve forces who, as these weapons proliferated, received these and replaced their older PHL-03 systems. However, the 59th, as its own long-range artillery system, had the PHL-03, which was, again, the older system, but it was still very destructive, as this 300mm system could dish out enormous devastation on enemy targets. And the BRE-8, or Fire Dragon tactical ballistic missiles, that were artillery-based from the 77th Group Army, who had, again, one of their battalion's firing batteries firing these missiles to hit a very important target in terms of the Joint Reserve Naval Air Station along Lake Worth in the White Settlement suburb. The PLA's actual strategic missile forces, the 612th and 613th, along with the 616th, all of which were from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, would all be firing their cruise and tactical ballistic missiles at this target and other targets within the DFW battle as well. As it must be understood that the 612th and 613th had been reinforced by called up additional reserve battalions to fire older, albeit widely mass-produced systems, including even older tactical ballistic missile systems that have been well maintained over time and were specifically earmarked for the use of some of these reserve battalions, such as the TEL-based DF2s, the TEL-based DF3As, and the DF4s, which were fired from special scaffolding. Although these were available in smaller numbers, these could effectively hit any target within the lower 48 from their positioning in northern Mexico. As the active duty components that ordinarily comprise these brigades were equipped with even more advanced missiles, such as the DF-17 hypersonic missile, which had its DF-ZF glide warheads, as well as also the DF-100 cruise missile, which was hypersonic, and of course tactical ballistic missiles such as the DF-21As, which were newer than the older missiles that were earmarked for the called-up reserve forces. The 616th would fire their tactical ballistic missiles, as they were not bolstered by any called-up battalions, but were simply just their active duty forces, firing their allocated DF-11As, their DF-15Bs, and DF-15Cs, which were the bunker-busting tactical ballistic missiles fired by this particular brigade. As the different missiles fired, including the arrival of the air power between 30 and 35 minutes in, as they came from their forward bases in Mexico, and even in some cases from the Caribbean, such as the strategic bombers in many cases, these forces would arrive, in terms of their total flight time to target, again by 30 to 35 minutes in. And as the slower moving subsonic cruise missiles would be fired first, such as the DH-10As, they would be followed by the hypersonic weapons minutes later, to where it would be, again, similar to a time-on-target technique, but with all the different missile systems and air power arriving, to where by the time the subsonic weapons arrived in the area, the hypersonic weapons would also be arriving in the area, as well as also the short-range, miniaturized artillery-based tactical ballistic missiles, such as the Fire Dragon missiles as well, and the air power, all of it arriving roughly about the same time to devastating effect. And if we go to the map, within this large 60-mile by 30-mile map in terms of east, west, north, south, the 59th PLA Group Army, also bolstered by the enormous additional capabilities brought by the active duty 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the active duty PLA's 83rd Group Army, who was operating along the coast in the Houston battle, as it was decided by the war planners that the 1st and 6th PLA and Marines, with their own air assault capabilities, would be sufficient for the battles along the coast, including in Houston, where the 1st PLA and Marine Brigade would partake with the 83rd Group Army and 36th, allowing the 83rd Group Army to free up its air assault forces for an additional enormous battle occurring within the DFW Metroplex, bolstering the already sizable 59th Group Army, as this reserve group army had 64,000 total personnel, which made it relatively sizable for a PLA group army, as most were between 50 and 55,000 in their total personnel numbers. And the additional troops from the PLA 83rd Group Army, as well as even 2 paramilitary National Production and Construction Corps battalions, which were effectively like combat-trained and armed combat engineers / civil engineers, would effectively be building up the forward operating bases that would be the major airports and even the captured installation, which would be in short order overrun by a battalion from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, as this light mechanized infantry battalion, a wheel-based force, along with an armored battalion racing towards the installation within the first 30 minutes, would arrive just in time for the total destruction from the air and missile forces, as well as artillery being fired into the area from the 19th Artillery Brigade of the 59th Group Army, as these artillery forces would be firing their 152mm PLL-66 howitzers, and also the PLL-01 howitzers, which were effectively in the same weight class, although they were 155mm, as in the same weight class as the 152mm systems, as they were effectively very similar in the ability of destruction, would be laying down enormous volumes of artillery fire from their CCP regime properties with their already pre-prepared berms that had been there for years, and the local population had no idea what they were for, nor did any of the civil authorities, and nobody asked questions, as these were just berms. And now that these howitzers have been brought out and set up in these firing positions on these CCP regime properties, now people understood that this was a security measure to protect these artillery forces, as they would have troops in foxholes, such as this light machine gun position, with this soldier with his QBJ-201 light machine gun guarding this CCP regime property, as these PLL-01 howitzers would lay down their powerful firepower. As also, there were 2 battalions total of the PLL-66s within the 59th Group Army's 19th Artillery Brigade, and there were 2 battalions total of the PLL-01s, which were the 155mm howitzers. There were also the 2 battalions of their 122mm Type 83 multiple launch rocket systems, and 1 battalion of their PHL-03 300mm rocket systems. These were all enormously destructive, but in terms of the SEAD operations and the destruction of the American industrial centers, in terms of their war production plants, such as the Lockheed Martin plant, which was in White Settlement and directly south of the installation, these would all be hit heavily by the artillery forces, missile forces, and the air power, which would be immense. As one of the 3 allocated H-6K heavy strategic bombers with its massive payload of 34,000 pounds would carpet munition the SHORAD forces of the American 1st of the 204th, as well as the Lockheed Martin plant, into total oblivion, as the 1st of the 124th Cav Squadron, effectively a battalion, but called a squadron in Cav terms, was the ground forces, which were the force protection element for the installation, whereas the 1st of the 204th, a SHORAD battalion, came from an entirely different unit entirely. It was not part of the 36th ID, as the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team was the main force in terms of protecting key sites throughout the DFW Metroplex, which included the installation with its 1st of the 124th Cav. The 1st of the 204th came from the Mississippi National Guard's 66th Troop Command and had been federalized, activated, and deployed to provide short-range air defenses as a force protection element for the Joint Reserve Naval Air Station, which was to be a centerpiece in the defenses, had the tandem anti-SAT, cyber strikes, and booting on of electronic warfare assets, both ground and air-based, as the H-6K heavy strategic bombers and the JH-7 strike aircraft carried some of the latest and greatest electronic warfare weapons, which were electromagnetic jamming pods known as the KG-600s. And as these forces came into play, one of the 3 H-6Ks allocated for the DFW battle as the 2 bomber squadrons, one of the widely available H-6Ks, as the PLAAF had these effectively as the backbone of their strategic bomber fleet, as they had 242 of these aircraft, and they had 40 of the H-20s, although the H-20s were massively more destructive than the already devastating H-6K. The H-6K and its electronic warfare capabilities made it a very formidable aircraft as well, as the H-20s were also conducting enormous strategic bombing raids of their own. They carried nearly 3 times as much payload as the H-6K, which carried 34,000 pounds, whereas the H-20 carried 90,000 pounds, or 45 tons. And there were 2 of these aircraft hitting the DFW Metroplex, in addition to the 3 H-6Ks, and 1 squadron of 12 JH-7s as well, as each of these strike aircraft could carry nearly 20,000 square pounds of payload, which was also very heavy hitting for just a strike aircraft. And the fighter aircraft, a J-10 squadron and also a J-11 squadron, provided the combat air patrols for the battle space to ensure air superiority over the battle space, as the Americans, although they had FA-18s, would find it exceedingly difficult to fly these aircraft safely, much less even be effective in combat, as their computer systems, their weapon systems, and more were failing, such as their radios and radars due to the electromagnetic jamming. And it was very difficult to keep these aircraft stable in flight, and they had no ability with radio to communicate to air traffic control, which could direct them to land, and were effectively stuck in the air. And they would be swatted down by the air defense forces of the 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade of the PLA's 59th Group Army. Also, the American refueling aircraft that happened to be on station in this area, flying in from Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma, the KC-46A aircraft, would be knocked out of the sky by an HQ-2J missile being fired from one of the firing batteries of one of two HQ-2J battalions, which were the medium-range, extremely high-altitude systems of the 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as they had two of these battalions. They had two of the medium-range, medium-altitude HQ-12 battalions, which were very capable air defense systems and could swat down fast-moving, slanted targets with relative ease, and they had a 30-mile radius, as well as a 15-mile total altitude. And these would play a role along with air-to-air missiles, such as a pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles with their 62-mile range being fired just as this J-10 squadron was entering the area, combining to swat down FA-18s that were already in flight at the opening of the invasion, trying to figure out what was going on, much less where to land and how to keep their aircraft stable. They were having a very difficult time. There were also two FA-18s attempting to make a takeoff as this invasion had begun, but they would find out very rapidly, in short order, that they would be completely annihilated as the missiles began to land at nearly about the same time, as again, it was like a time-on-target technique in a way, as all of these different missiles fired at different times within the first 30 minutes were all beginning to reach the area at roughly the same time. As this was a very well-coordinated strike, the ground forces of the armored battalion beginning to arrive were backed up by their anti-tank company within their battalion, as each armored battalion had one anti-tank company. In the case of the PLA's 59th Group Army and its 35th Armored Brigade, each battalion had one company of the HJ-10 based systems known as the AFT-10s. Each of these could carry 8 missiles apiece, and these HJ-10s were very long range for an ATGM, and they had a total range of 6.2 miles and were very destructive as well. As it pertained to the fire support company for the light mechanized infantry forces, as one battalion of light mechanized infantry from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade would arrive on scene after briefly assisting another light mechanized infantry battalion with crushing a neighborhood full of armed reactionary civilians emerging from their homes with weapons in hand, totally confused or upset about losing the grid and everything else, and was not sure what was going on. So many emerged and realized that there was serious trouble afoot as all the explosions had begun, and were thus hit hard by the 24th Light Infantry Brigade's artillery of their PCL-181 self-propelled truck-based howitzers, which were highly mobile and wheel-based, just like the IFVs and APCs of these forces, as their light mechanized infantry battalions were equipped with the ZBD-08 IFVs with their exceedingly potent 35mm Gatling autocannon and 2 HJ-73C ATGMs apiece, which were short range but still effective and destructive. And they had their APC-based systems with a heavy machine gun turret, often with a W-85 heavy machine gun or others in that class. As their fire support company within each mechanized infantry battalion consisted of a wheel-based anti-tank force, as these WZ-551s were anti-tank vehicles equipped with 4 HJ-09s apiece which had just over half the range of the even more powerful and longer range HJ-10. Although these HJ-9s had a 3.5-mile range, they were still very capable and provided excellent anti-armor capabilities to these light mechanized infantry forces, as they now ran roughshod as they approached the installation, running over all resistance in their path, annihilating them with crippling weaponry. As one combat platoon from their fire support company, which consisted of these anti-tank vehicles, would accompany a company of light mechanized infantry first to arrive into the area from their battalion that was moving in to assist the armored battalion, who was also moving in, but moving in from the east, striking westbound and towards the installation. These forces would cripple the American tank company that was guarding the east-facing side of the installation, where they had their bivouac site, and these state-of-the-art Type 96Bs, which were among the absolute best main battle tanks in the world, although the Type 99A, which the Chinese also had, which equipped many of the active duty armored forces, was even better. Although the Type 96B was still a highly advanced main battle tank, they equipped the 35th Armored Brigade. And as they struck towards the American installation, following them was also their two armored infantry companies, which comprised part of the battalion, as it consisted of 4 tank companies, 2 armored infantry companies, and, of course, their anti-tank company and headquarters and support company, which was 8 total companies which comprised the armored battalion. Just as there were the 6 light mechanized infantry companies in each light mechanized infantry battalion, there was 1 company, which was their fire support company of their anti-tank vehicles, and there was their headquarters and support company. Again, 8 companies, which made up the light mechanized infantry battalion that was attacking along with the armored battalion's forces. Although there would be 2 American tank crews that would put up an excellent fight considering the circumstances, as they would be quick on their weaponry and get out 2 depleted uranium shells, 1 per tank, and destroy 2 of the Type 96B main battle tanks with these very potent shells. All of the American tanks would be completely annihilated, not only by the outstanding Type 96B main battle tanks with their wide array of ammunition choices, their outstanding armored protection, even the ability to fire ATGMs, which would severely outrange the Abrams tanks. They would also be hit by the HJ-10s being fired from further away, as these had outstanding range pertaining to the anti-tank company equipped with their AFT-10s, which were the HJ-10 based systems. They could sit further back away from the line of contact and fire these missiles, which were ISR directed, and not have to worry about any return fire, as the armored infantry would move in behind the tank companies and ensure that the flanks were completely cleared, as scenes like this would be common throughout the entire city. In this image, HJ-10s are flying overhead, as are the CH-901A loitering munitions, which themselves were fired at the battalion level, as each battalion headquarters and support company had their own combat drone section with a TEL-based system which could fire 48 CH-901As at a time. These could either be equipped with fragmentation warheads, they could be equipped with HE warheads, or they could be equipped with heat warheads, which were excellent for destroying tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Also, the IFVs and the Armored Infantry Forces were the ZBD-04s, which also had their ATGM pods for HJ-08 or HJ-09 ATGMs, and they fired a 100mm main gun. They had a 30mm autocannon, which was also very destructive, and a 7.62 by 54mm coax. And they had their Type 89A APCs with heavy machine gun turrets, like so. Some troops here beginning to get into wedge formation after emerging from their Type 89A to check the area. The combat was absolutely devastating, as were the air-delivered munitions, a mix of precision munitions such as laser-guided munitions or Baidu or satellite-guided ammunition, and also free-fall munitions, as the JH-7s could conduct dive attacks and drop these munitions from special racks on their aircraft, giving them a relatively decent spread, but also hitting accurately a target area. As this map again depicts a 4-mile east to west by 2-mile north-south area. This is Lake Worth, and this is relatively effectively a zoom-out map to show a larger area, whereas this map to the south is more of a zoom-in map showing a smaller area of 1 mile east to west by 1 kilometer north to south. This was the Lockheed Martin plant, which happened to be along Lockheed Boulevard here, which was directly, effectively to the south of this area. It's only about a half a kilometer from this particular map. Although, again, this is more blown out, whereas this is more zoomed out. And this is I-820, the ring road that effectively circumnavigates the Fort Worth metro area. As it moves through this area, I-30 effectively is to the south of White Settlement, which encompasses this quasi-industrial area with this major defense industrial plant belonging to Lockheed Martin, which was being defended by a large portion of the 1st of the 204th, the SHORAD battalion that was deployed to protect both the installation as a force protection measure from close-in air attacks, as it was a SHORAD battalion equipped with the Avenger systems, which were Humvee-based Stinger missile systems, effectively, and they were deployed with their Hammer radars, which were a multi-mission radar, as well as also their AN-TPQ 53 radars, and these would effectively not be working in this situation, again due to all the electronic warfare jamming from both the 59th Electronic Warfare Regiment, their ground-based systems, and the air-based systems from the heavy strategic bombers such as the H-6Ks and the strike aircraft such as the JH-7 Flying Leopards, again equipped with the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods. They effectively blanketed the entire area with interference, and as the KC-46A had been shot down by a HQ-2J high-altitude medium-range system, the medium-range, medium-altitude HQ-12s were firing their missiles, as each system carried 2 apiece, at the FA-18s that were already airborne when the invasion began. And as these forces began to arrive, a very brief exchange of fire took place, again, where the PLA lost 2 tanks. They lost 1 to a depleted uranium round here. They lost another here with the crews KIA'd. Vehicles would be towed away, and attempted repairs would be done at a later time, but for the most part, the 125mm shells, also with loitering munitions, CH-901As equipped with heat rounds, were entering the area, and 1,000-pounders were being dropped. 4 dropped in this area alone, as these tanks were now moving up. These were moving in and firing at each other, and there were small hilly areas along these open lots. As one were to look at a map of this area, there were empty lots and fields and sparse wooded areas spread throughout. There was a neighborhood down this street, and beyond this area, these PLA forces moved in and attacked from the east, firing their 125 millimeter weapons into this area. They had a relatively long range and could fire several miles, while the HJ-10 ATGMs are flying overhead and hitting targets that were ISR directed by the quadcopter, high altitude, and even satellite-based ISR assets linked into the real-time AI battlefield data processing system that even directed the movements of these forces into place and directed them on where and what to fire at what targets based on the ISR assets. Even the radar systems were tied into the real-time AI battlefield data processing system and assisted the fighter aircraft from 60 miles away, such as the J-10 squadron now entering the area, as this was a total 60-mile by 30-mile area, directed them in firing their PL-12 air-to-air missiles as one aircraft fired two toward the installation as they were within range. These PL-12s flying into the area, along with all of these HQ-12 missiles, were striking these aircraft. Two fired at each aircraft from these air defense systems to ensure that all the aircraft were completely annihilated and there was no way out. As these PL-12 systems also came in, they too struck these two aircraft, one each, along with the HQ-12s. There was no escape. These aircraft, again, were already having an exceedingly difficult time flying due to all the electronic warfare assets in use. And these tactical ballistic missiles, a mix of the DF-3As fired from Mexico from the called-up reserve battalions that were now reinforcing the 612th and 613 Strategic Missile Forces, as well as also the active-duty battalions ordinarily comprising those brigades firing two DF-100 hypersonic cruise missiles at this area, which, due to their payload and rate of impact, their exceedingly high speed, would create massive craters, as would these two DF-17 DFZF hypersonic glide warheads that were the warhead payloads of the DF-17 hypersonic missiles. These two were DF-10 or DH-10A subsonic systems, and these were fired even before the hypersonics were, and were arriving at about the same time. As the Fire Dragon missiles, or the BRE-8 750mm tactical ballistic missiles with their 225-mile range, were well within range to hit basically the entirety of the DFW area, although they were targeted for this particular installation, the Joint Naval Reserve Fort Worth Naval Air Station, as well as the bivouac site that was along I-820, but it was targeted in a way to ensure that I-820 was spared because it would be needed for logistical and troop movements, as the Americans, due to the degraded communications environment, had a total breakdown in command and control, and portions of the 1st of the 124th Cav Squadron, or effectively a battalion, but in Cav terms a squadron, were moving throughout the area with two of its companies being engaged. It's one tank company and one of its rifle companies, which effectively were oriented towards target acquisition and reconnaissance purposes. They were moving along the lake to effectively defend the bridge and prevent the PLA forces from crossing, but the engagement lasted a relatively short time, as again, one combat platoon, one out of 4 combat platoons belonging to their fire support company, which was an anti-tank company, of their wheel-based WZ-550s had entered the area along with the first company to arrive of the light mechanized infantry battalion, as one of its comprising light mech infantry companies had arrived directly across the lake to cover the movement of 3 additional companies that were moving in behind it, as the different companies gradually disengaged from destroying this early pocket that formed of armed reactionary civilians, as both of these battalions worked together with enormous artillery fire, again from their PCL 181s, their 155mm truck-based howitzers. These armed reactionary civilians were destroyed exceedingly fast, as they were confused. They were effectively in a state of chaos, as they weren't sure at all what was going on, and this battalion and this battalion's comprising companies had surrounded, fought, and they both gradually disengaged as they were destroyed. As the first company to leave this area from the CCP regime property, as others fought and surrounded these forces, would arrive, hold their position across the lake, and wait for the other companies to disengage and follow behind them. As again, the Americans were in a state of confusion due to the total communications, grid down, ISR down, everything down due to the anti-SAT, cyber, and EW assets. They would flee to the southwest of the city and do so along I-820 because they were not necessarily sure how to get to where they were trying to go, so they opted to basically retreat along the interstate, which actually ended up being a wise decision because the PLA wanted to avoid destroying critical infrastructure, including highway networks such as interstates. So they were effectively spared as they fled the area, although this particular company that was bivouacked at this site on the west end of the installation, as its perimeter fencing went through this area here, the tank company on the east-facing side and the rifle company on the west side, they moved to block the PLA forces from crossing, but the high potency of the 35mm Gatling autocannon, as well as even the ATGMs, the HJ-73Cs, as well as also the heavy machine gun fire from the APC versions, as well as the HJ-09 ATGMs that were being fired from the platoon that accompanied the first company of mechanized infantry forces, the light mechanized infantry troops, effectively laid down enormous firepower, with one squad even disembarking from this platoon from the APC on the very end, and took up positions along the lake and fired HJ-08 ATGMs at these vehicles as they approached. They hurriedly moved into this area, which partially saved them from the missile strikes and the strike aircraft as the JH-7s moved in. Again, as they lost one tank to a rapid exchange of fire, the 125mm fire, the entry of the loitering munitions fired from the armored battalion from its headquarters and support company, as well as their combat drone section, as well as also the airdrop munitions, were simply too much and annihilated this platoon, this combat platoon, and this combat platoon as the CH-901As with their heat warheads came in. 125mm fire came in with very powerful tungsten sabot ammunition. The Chinese produced enormous quantities of tungsten, even used it in their tank armor as part of an alloy, an RHA and tungsten alloy. Their tungsten sabot ammunition was exceedingly potent, as was the DU ammunition, which the Chinese also possessed. And they used their sabot ammunition effectively on these armored forces, along with the heat warheads from the CH-901As crashing down onto the roofs of these tanks, which utterly annihilated them, along with the munitions that were dropped, 1,000 pounders, as this one dropped 4 onto this group. This one dropped 8, which spread out and pounded the campsite for this company, this tank company's headquarters platoon, annihilated them and these 4 tanks, along with the fire coming from a distance from the 125mm main guns. As these tanks were also destroyed in the same way, 125mm fire, CH-901A strikes. This aircraft continued on rapidly. Right after dropping these, they dropped 4,000 more pounds on this building, which had in it 50 personnel, destroying it and the neighboring building, along with BRE-8 tactical ballistic missile strikes as they came in and hit targets here and here, destroying this building with 20 personnel in it. Tactical ballistic missiles such as DF-11As, DF-15Bs, although no DF-15Cs were fired from the 616th, the DF-15Bs and DF-11As were fired by them at this site, as well as a few of the DF-3As, again fired from the reinforced 612th and 613th, who had their reserve battalions firing some of these missiles that were allocated to them for their use, as well as also a few DF-21As as well, and the BRE-8s coming in, and also the airstrikes, the hypersonic DFCF glide warheads from the DF-17s, DF-100 hypersonic cruise missiles, which, by the way, again, the DF 17 DFZF glide, hypersonic glide warheads and DF-100s left massive, enormous craters at the impact site. These were more than enough to destroy underground bunkers, as the DF-15C, which was a bunker-busting tactical ballistic missile, was not required for use, as these hypersonics were more than enough and left massive devastation in their wake. And these BRE-8s also joined in the destruction, hitting key buildings and wiping them out in conjunction with the tactical ballistic missile strikes, hitting the tarmac, all the FA-18s lined up, airdrop munitions from the JH-7s, dropping massive payloads, which also was a SEAD operation as well, as these missiles came in from other JH-7s that were a bit further away. Although they were further away, they were able to use their standoff KD-88 air-to-ground cruise missiles, which had a range of over 100 miles, and they were fired from other JH-7s further away and off this map. Although these came in to do direct strikes, these four, and they hit targets in the installation and again outside of the installation and again inside the installation, and even right out here as well, dropping 4,000 pounds just outside of this area to destroy it but not cause any damage to the highway. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system had guided these forces on all their movements and strikes to preserve infrastructure and also to cause maximum devastation to the American forces. These CH-901As that had circled the battlefield had come in and hit these two vehicles right off the bat. A Bradley IFV with its heat warhead, and this M113 following behind was hit. These other two that made it in this area were fired at by 35mm Gatling autocannon fire, HJ-73C ATGMs, as well as also the other two loitering munitions, hitting them at roughly about the same time. As this platoon moved in, they had split up to where two vehicles went this way and the other two went this way under the highway bridge. Great care was taken not to damage the highway, but they were fired at by man-portable HJ-08 ATGMs. They were fired at by 35mm autocannon fire on this side and were utterly destroyed. These were fired at by 35mm fire, and besides the HJ-09s that were fired at these forces, these MRAPs that were part of this base security elements, these two Avenger systems, as there was again an Avenger platoon spread out along the edge of the runway along the lakeside, and all of these base security forces that were defending the installation were all destroyed by these cruise missile and tactical ballistic missile strikes, as these cruise missiles, the DH-10A subsonics, DF-100 hypersonics, DFZF hypersonic glide warheads, and all these tactical ballistic missiles, including even the short-range small tactical ballistic missiles, the BRE-8s, coming in that were artillery-based, hitting all of these areas. These were the destructive radiuses of all the various different missile types. So anywhere there was a circle meant that this entire area was destroyed by the tactical ballistic and/or cruise missiles, as they were all hitting multiple targets, including even the airstrikes that came in, hitting these targets with 8,000 pounds dropped from this aircraft, which already dropped 4,000 on these on these tanks. This one dropped 8,000 here and then dropped 4,000 more here, which was only 12,000 pounds, so they carried upwards of almost 20,000 square pounds. They had more payload in addition to this, and will use it in later close air support operations. This aircraft dropped another 8,000 pounds here. This was effectively a SEAD operation rolled together with the destruction of these naval air forces of their FA-18 fighter aircraft. 4,000 pounds dropped in this area. Tactical ballistic missile strikes from also the hypersonic missile strikes and cruise missile strikes. It was all enormously destructive. All these personnel in these buildings, 100 in this building, in this hangar there was 120, there was 20 in this building, there was 50 in this building, there was 150 in this building, and there were 80 in this building here. Again, 50 and 20. They were all annihilated by the crippling air and missile strikes. And as the total breakdown in command and control affected these comprising companies of the 1st of the 124th Cav just as much as it did the 1st of the 204th, the Shorad Battalion, that was part of the Mississippi National Guard's 66th Troop Command, but was attached to the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the 36th ID, were all completely disoriented, and again, these forces retreated, including on this area as they went around. The artillery had struck in the SEAD operations, as all of these imminent strike markers indicate they hit the plant with enormous shelling, and each of these strike markers was multiple shells. It wasn't just one shell, as there were 2 full battalions, one PLL 66 battalion out of the 2 that were part of the 19th Artillery Brigade, as well as one PLL 01 battalion, which was also part of the Artillery Brigade, as they had 2 of these PLL-01 battalions. 1 battalion of the PLL-01s and 1 of the PLL-66s were completely devoted to the SEAD operation, as well as the heavy carpet munitioning of this area, as I-30 was directly south and off this map, and I-820 was directly to the west off this map. Great care was taken not to hit these highways, as this heavy strategic bomber, the H-6K, only began to drop its munitions just after it passed over I-30. And it dropped many thousands of pounds, as many 1,000-pound munitions, even a few 2,000-pounders, were dropped from the aircraft, from both of its internal bomb bay and its wings, as it was enormously destructive within this 1 mile by 1 kilometer area. These armed reactionary civilians and their technicals racing up the street, up this Lockheed Boulevard towards the installation, thinking that that would be a safe place to go to try to hold out, would be sorely mistaken, and they would be destroyed by the outer blast radius of this spread of munitions, as this aircraft was tens of thousands of feet in the air. It was 45,000 feet in the air and dropping these payloads, which had a massive spread. They destroyed these vehicles, including this one racing up the street. As this was moving very fast, the payloads would hit it as well. This one did a U-turn and just made it out of the area, barely, as these tactical ballistic missiles, the same types that also hit the installation, were also hitting this factory and these air defense forces. This was the Detachment 1 with its radar and security personnel. This was Bravo Battery, Charlie Battery, and the headquarters battery of the 1st of the 204th Battalion. All these tactical ballistic missiles coming in hit the plant and destroyed it, in conjunction with the heavy strategic bombing, which also served 2 purposes: to assist in destroying the factory and these forces, in conjunction with all the tactical ballistic missiles, even cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles, DF-17, DFZF hypersonic glide warheads, hitting this area, causing massive destruction. As the map opens up, the artillery's already blasting here. There had already been a cruise missile strike here, which annihilated this building and left it in rubble and a massive crater in it. These forces are, again, the 2 companies, 2 rifle companies, retreating from the area that would move along I-820 to get out of the area alive. As these forces moved out of the building, as they were in the plant itself, they were running out of the building, would be hit by artillery, as the building would also be hit by mass shelling, tactical ballistic missile strikes from DF-11As, DF-15Bs, DF-3As, and also DF-21As were hitting this area, in conjunction with the DH-10A cruise missiles, a DF-100 cruise missile, which was hypersonic, and 2 DFZF hypersonic glide warheads from 2 DF-17 hypersonic missiles, and the heavy strategic carpet munitioning over this area. As again, it was half a kilometer to the south of this particular part of White Settlement. The armored forces would cross the bridge and effectively penetrate the facility, now totally wrecked and destroyed, as 2 platoons would go in this way, and 2 platoons from this other tank company, not the tank company guarding their flanks and their crossing, but the tank company moving into the area, would penetrate through the south, and then they would move up along the west-facing end of the now annihilated facility, and there would only be a few survivors left that would challenge them, but they wouldn't be able to do anything. It was more of an act of desperation than anything else, as there's some green on this arrow. They completely annihilated them with their tanks, as they had barely survived all the missile strikes and airstrikes. There was a few survivors, again, that tried to put up a fight against the tanks, but had no chance whatsoever at all. And effectively, this company now occupied this facility, which was now completely annihilated. And although the runway had some minor damages, it could be fixed. And now, 3 companies were crossing by the end of this from the light mechanized infantry battalion that was also partaking in this battle as they were firing across Lake Worth, while the armor was firing into the area. At the same time, all the missile strikes and airstrikes came in to allow for their forces to move in and capture the site, which they did. In the south, half a kilometer away, the heavy strategic carpet munitioning, tactical ballistic missiles, as well as cruise missile strikes, hypersonic strikes, and artillery strikes, massed artillery strikes from 152 and 155 shells from the PLL-66s and PLL-01s totally annihilated this entire area. As an industrial site, it was completely in total ruins, as this was in a quasi-industrial area just to the south of the installation. There were houses in this particular area, a gas station, there were some larger homes and shops, even fast food places. They were mostly oriented towards the base personnel. Also near this area was a defense contracting office, which was also hit by a tactical ballistic missile and artillery, although it was not present on this map or this map. It was just off into the slight northeast. As these forces would effectively get away for a short time, they would be pursued by the same armored battalion that overran the installation and the same light mechanized infantry battalion that would pursue them, surround them, and with artillery support destroy them, as they would temporarily have safety as they fled along I-820 due to the ISR assets and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system deeming it not a priority to strike these forces. They would then make it into a suburban area where they would be surrounded, cut off, and destroyed. These 2 light mechanized infantry battalions and their CCP properties to effectively defend artillery forces had moved in, cleared the flanks, and would now occupy the already overrun and destroyed installation, these 2 battalions. This battalion would move towards I-30 and completely cut it off, as these 2 air assault battalions are actually moving towards Weatherford off the map to capture it. These forces would be surrounded and destroyed, and these 2 FA-18s that were a bit further from the installation that would fly over the Meacham Air Base would be fired at by the air defense forces, as well as air-to-air missiles from the fighter aircraft conducting combat air patrols. They had not been shot down over the base, but were further away at the time, but were already being fired at by air defense forces. More to come in the DFW battle. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines.